Welcome back to The Things Not Named. I'm Joshua Dolezal. Willa Cather said that the presence of the thing not named gives high quality to literature. And this year, I'm applying that idea to medicine, asking how we might be more attentive to what goes unsaid in the clinic, in popular culture, and in the experience of illness from the patient's side. My guest today is Dr. Danielle Ofri. Dr. Ofri is the founder and editor in chief of Bellevue Literary Review, the first literary journal to arise from a medical setting, now an award winning independent nonprofit literary arts organization that's celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. So we'll get into that in a bit. She's also a primary care internist at Bellevue Hospital and a clinical professor of medicine at New York University. She's the author of 7 books, all nonfiction. My favorites are Singular Intimacies, about her medical residency, Incidental Findings, which frames patient stories with her own experience as a maternity patient, and Medicine in Translation, about her work with immigrants and their complicated personal and medical histories. Her essays have been selected for Best American Essays twice, and also for Best American Science Writing. Dr. Ofri has won many awards, including a 2023 Guggenheim, the 2022 National Humanism and Medicine Medal from the Gold Foundation, and an honorary doctorate of humane letters. As an ever struggling student of the cello, she's also hoping to someday complete the ever uphill slog through all 36 movements of the Bach cello suites. So, Danielle, welcome and nice to see you again.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, did I get that right? All 7 of your books are nonfiction?
That is correct. In fact, I just got in the mail this week the simplified Chinese version of What Patients Say, What Doctors Hear. So it's always fun to see the new translations. Yes, all nonfiction.
Very nice. And you just told me that you have a new book coming out. So, can you tell us just briefly about that and
Sure.
when to
Yeah,
watch for it?
due out in April. It's called The Body Knows How to Die, and it is about facing our fears of death. And it's been really an exciting book to write, both talking to my patients, but talking to other people in healthcare and hospice, people who are facing death themselves or have accompanied someone, a child, a parent. And it feels like it's one of the things that nobody wants to talk about. But of course, we all have to talk about it and how to get past those fears. So the body knows how to die.
Hmm. Hmm. So, that's taken mostly from your patient stories.
It's actually somewhat, but it's more reported. So following someone through their illness, talking to caregivers. So it's been writing. It's a little bit, if you think about, you mentioned Singular Intimacies, when I have kind of like little narrative, separate stories. It's been that kind of thing, but going out into the community and talking to someone in India and talking to someone, in California, and it's been really interesting to see what people are struggling with and why uh, what prevents them from being able to think about how they might plan their death and help themselves through the death and grief of others.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I can't wait to read it. I was struck, getting ready for our call, that it's been so Bellevue Literary Review is 25 years old, and I think you and I connected shortly after that had started. I was first aware of your work, I think, because of your essay Merced, which
Mhm.
was chosen for the 2022 or 2002, I'm sorry, volume edited by Stephen Jay Gould, and it seemed like that launched your career. Is that fair to say, that essay?
That was. It's hard to say what is a launch, but that certainly was one of the first early recognitions. Yeah, it was just quite exciting.
What was it like to be chosen for the Best American for the first time?
Um, I guess you don't expect it. I mean, mostly I was sending out my pieces to literary magazines who have circulations that were smaller than my medical school class. So you don't think anyone actually reads any of them. So it was quite a surprise. And it also kind of restores the faith. You're kind of slogging away at home. You're trying to put these stories together, and then, wow, someone not only read it but thought it was worthy to be included in an anthology that I've always admired. So it was just really both inspiring and encouraging, and helped me move on and pull those essays together to a book.
Well, I'm asking about this partly because, we'll talk about the journal you started, but literary journals have really become increasingly embattled, and that whole scene has changed a lot. So around the time that we met, I was also launching my own writing life and publishing in places like Gettysburg Review and
Mhm.
Kenyon Review. I think Merced appeared in the, um, was it the Missouri Review? Is that right?
Correct. Missouri Review.
Yeah. So the model was that there's somebody who's a curator who edits that, who has, this kind of sophisticated taste, and that you satisfy that gatekeeper, and that's how you prove your legitimacy as a writer. And so you you get accepted, and it's a big accomplishment, and then an agent discovers you, and you're off and running. I'm wondering how you make sense of that now, because that's not at all how publication works now. Everyone, like, I started the Substack, everybody's doing their
Yeah.
own thing online. It's much more like self-publishing has been normalized.
Right. And it's funny because when you describe that paradigm, I don't quite think of it as like a gatekeeper. Because as editor of BLR, we now get 5,000 submissions a year, more than that. And so we're reading through them. So I don't see ourselves as gatekeepers at all. I see ourselves as, you know, reaching into this, pile and community of writers and trying to find new voices to bring through it. It's not, I don't feel like we're closing the gate to others, but trying
Mm,
to bring new people in. And it's such an exciting thing to do and to watch writers, launch. We published an early story of Celeste Ng, Abraham Verghese. And in fact, Celeste Ng, when she was interviewed in the New York Times, apparently, and I had not realized this, but had gone into a postpartum depression. And she said, I didn't think I could write again. And then her story in BLR won a pushcart. And that sort of like parted the clouds and helped her keep going. And as a journal that we write about health, illness, and healing, it's nice to see to be involved in a writer's sort of healing process as well. But I do think of it as an opening of the gate, not a closing of the gate at all. And you're right, we have our taste, but that's why there's so many literary journals out there of many different kinds of tastes. So if it doesn't fit for our piece, it will find a home elsewhere. So I look at it as a way of widening, the
mhm.
lanes. I mean, obviously anyone can self-publish, and many people self-publish wonderful things. I mean, I will say that at BLR, one thing we do is we work very closely with authors and on revising pieces. We almost never take something and just plop it in the journal. We work 20, 30 hours, multiple revisions, and many writers have said it was the most intense editing experience they ever had. And so when it finally
Mhm.
gets on the page, it's really hopefully at its best. But we are excited to help people bring a piece, even further than it may have gone. So I do think that certainly many literary magazines, will put in that effort. And so what comes out, it is well polished. And I certainly have seen self-published things that have typos or don't read them. You can put anything out there. So it can be, I think, a little harder as a reader, when you have this tsunami of self-published things, and some things are great and there's a lot of things that are, medium. Um, but hopefully, editors and publishers do a lot of the work of sifting through, things and helping things get really polished. So when you finally read them, they are quite good.
Well, I maybe misspoke with the term gatekeeper, but what you're describing is curation, at
Mm.
least. So there is a taste that is your filter, how you select things, and then you're nurturing. And what I'm kind of pushing against is this
Mm.
idea now that if you're just authentic to yourself, that's the most important thing, and craft kind of doesn't matter as much anymore. That's what I'm seeing in a lot of circles. The
Oh,
conversation
yeah,
has
and which
shifted.
yeah. So I disagree entirely. I think craft. I remember when I discovered craft. So I was walking on Second Avenue. So I I took a year and a half off after residency trainings. I did this long MD PhD program, took forever and a day. I took off a year and a half, did locum tenens, traveled around the country, and started writing down the stories of that intense experience. And then when I came back to get a job at Bellevue, which I knew I wanted to come back, there was a economic crisis, a hiring freeze, and they only could take me on for a 60% FTE position, which I'd never thought about working anything less than full time, but I needed a job, so I took it. So on one of my afternoons off, I'm walking on Second Avenue. There's a little yellow plastic box, Gotham Writers Workshop, and I take a pamphlet out and I check into my first writing class. And that was my first introduction to craft. I've always been a reader. And I think as a reader, you appreciate craft even without the vocabulary to articulate what it is you're appreciating. But you know that that's a great sentence, or what a great scene, or I can't wait to turn the page. You're responding to craft and, of course, talent. But coming from the writer's side for the first time, to see the power of craft, to take a story. and make it so much more powerful, which is what we do at BLR. We're just strong believers in craft. And you really can, and you can be true to yourself and write a great story. And so many of the pieces that we turn away at BLR, especially the nonfiction, it is these are often very moving experiences. But a moving experience is not the same thing as a moving piece of writing. And that is where craft comes in. Now, if you don't want to do craft and you just want to write for your own personal satisfaction, that's fine. But if you'd like to get someone to read that page and feel what you're feeling, craft can really help. So it's, not something that one must do, but you really can take something so much further and get the person on the other end. A typical thing when someone writes about my experience with illness, they start with day one and work their way through the end of the illness because that's how you experience it. But that's not what's emotionally powerful. And when you read a great piece of an illness narrative, it's often not linear at all. And if you take the time to analyze the craft, you can see now the author has shifted things around, all truthful, nothing's made up in this nonfiction, hopefully. But with
Hmm.
that power of craft, then gets you as the reader, you are gripped and then you're sobbing by the end. And that isn't accidental. It is a lot of craft and work. So if you're a writer out there and you've never focused on craft, I encourage you to try. It's like getting extra horsepower in your car, and it can drive your prose and poetry that much further.
Well, I'm thinking of one of your early essays, and then I want to get to a recent piece in the Lancet here shortly.
Mhm.
But this is called M&M, which is short for
Mhm.
morbidity and mortality, and it's a braided narrative, which is another one of these craft techniques, right?
Mhm.
Where there are two storylines that are woven throughout, and one of them is the clinical version that you have to report at this conference where medical errors are reported, and there's an effort to learn from them, but often some shaming involved. So the voice is very constrained. But then there are these long italicized, sections in between that, which is the unspoken story, which is the emotional truth of that experience. So you go back and forth and you see the tension between them. And that opens up a different kind of meaning than, like you're saying, just a chronological report that's faithful to just
Well,
the
actually, if I
literal
can
facts.
tell you, because that actually has three voices. And when I first wrote it, I wrote about what happened. And then I wrote about the conference, but then I also happened to have had my printed copy of my what I actually read. So I had my quotes and I had them in order. And someone said, "Why don't you tear them up?" And I so then I could take one scene, describe what happened, show us talking about, and then read the words. So I'll just give one example. There's a scene in that piece that we have to intubate a patient. We have to put a breathing tube down his throat, and this guy is fighting. It was a horrific scene. I'm with the surgical consult, and we're holding this guy down, and pink sputum is flying everywhere. We're sweating. You feel like you're attacking him. It was horrific. But then in the presentation, and I have my paper, it says the patient was intubated with difficulty. Period.
Mhm.
And that's how we encapsulate that scene. So you could, in a piece, write about, oh, how we speak about patients, how we talk, but you don't have to. If you use the craft to just put those two things adjacent, you don't have to say anything. And if you let the reader pull it out from the way you've done it, it's so much more powerful, but more gratifying for the reader to get it as opposed to be told it.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I love that example. Well, it's a nice shift then to your, I think, most recent essay in the Lancet, Why Medicine Needs Literary Magazines. So, could you tell us a little about why you needed to write that essay and what you argue there?
Well, it is BLR's 25th anniversary, and this is a BLR issue number 50, 50 issues coming out. Just shocking to believe. And so just sort of thinking back, how did we come to be doing a literary magazine in a medical setting? And so that's what was the drive to write it. And so I started the journal with Marty Blazer and a few other people right when I came back after those 18 months traveling. I came back to Bellevue, and I remember I would ask my students were handing in their H&Ps, history and physicals, which are pretty dull to read. And I said, just tell me the patient's story. Ask them what it's like to have diabetes. And those essays kind of became the impetus. Maybe we should make some kind of journal. And we came up with the idea of making it a public journal, not just an in-house journal, and just creative writing, poetry, fiction, nonfiction, health, illness, and healing. And we got 1,000 submissions like overnight. So it was clear that we had touched a nerve. And the idea that there's so much writing out there about medicine and health, but a lot of it is like, the top 10 tips for asthma or get your calcium doesn't really get to what it feels like to be ill. And because we all have been touched by that, either ourselves or we've taken care of an ill child or an aging parent, we've all been there. And that vulnerability that illness engenders, I mean, it's like an earthquake for every single person. And um, we discovered that I think that people need some kind of creative way, some way to grapple with that, not just what the illness is about or the 5-year survival rate of your cancer. And so so I want to sort of think back of that experience of why, how and why we got to where we are, and because I don't think that medicine can tell us about the disease, but not much about the experience of being ill. And if you're the
Mm.
patient, you are ill. You're not having a disease. You're sick. You're feeling sick, and those are such different things. And knowing what the disease is, only addresses one an important part, no doubt, but only one part of what it feels like as a human being.
Hmm. So I think you said something about how pneumonia or um, fill in the blank, Lyme disease or anything that
Mm,
someone would be diagnosed
yep.
with, plays out in dozens of different ways across even one city because it intersects with personal life, with the social coordinates, as some would say, of disease. So that's what you get from a story is the context, the human context of what not just the symptoms, but all the things that might either impact getting the disease or impact the complications and getting treatment or surviving the
And
psychology of
and
it.
and what it means to the person. I mean, for some people, getting ill can feel like a complete loss of self. They've just
Mm,
everything that their power is all gone. For some people, they walk away. Okay, no big deal. It's so intriguing why that's the same pneumonia can be so different for different people. And and where do you go with that fear? I mean, what do you do when you think about, can you still have sex with your partner after they've had cancer? We were just looking at a story that dealt exactly with that, and we send out a weekly read from VLR, and that was one of our recent ones. And I was reading the story again, and it was just brilliant because nobody ever talks about that, but that is what people think when they get home in bed with their partner. Can I touch them? Um, and
mm,
it's really amazing. You can delve into all of these things that come in, and particularly with poetry, which will just, you know, tease out just one little strand of the emotional experience and just pull that one out and hold it up to the light to just look at that one thing, that one little bit that we, in a chaos of being sick, there's so many things, there's thousands of things going on that we often run roughshod over many of them. But a poem gives you a chance to take a breath and look at one little piece of it and just think about that and let that settle. And sometimes that can give you a little bit of peace in that spot. And it's hard to get peace when you're sick.
mhm. Well, and that human dignity and the
Mhm.
selfhood part of it is so important to a patient and also to families. How does it improve, or does it improve the quality of medical diagnosis or treatment? To have a story based approach to um, documenting history and physicals. Does that have measurable, impacts on medical care itself?
Abraham Verghese once wrote a piece years ago called "What Doctors Can Learn from Novelists." And I loved it because what it did, if you think about the master diagnosticians of yore, the white coated, bow tied, gentlemen who are the giants that we trained under, but they were fabulous diagnosticians. And part of it is they were so keenly observant, right? Back when you didn't have a CT at the drop of the hat or an MRI or an echo, you had to be very observant in the way that a good novelist is. And when you read an Ian McEwan, description of a scene or a person, you are just getting, just such a rich, multi-layered, it's not just, oh, that person was tall and blonde, right? You get such depth. And you get that with those clinicians. And it's a bit of a skill that we've lost. But writing and creativity, that trains us in the skill of acute observation. And there's just so many times where that makes a difference. A person walks in, you just can't just like check the box. Oh, I have a cough and a fever. But there's so much more. And because most of our patients, or many of our patients, will have things they don't necessarily tell you on the first go around. They may come and say, I feel lousy, right? They're really speaking in metaphor. And it's your job as a clinician to interpret that metaphor. And feeling lousy, they could have pneumonia, they could have vasculitis, they could be, experiencing abuse at home, there could be an eating disorder or sexual disorder, they could be being trafficked, there could be depression, many, many different things. And they could have cancer. And all of the treatments of which are so vastly different. If you're not observant on what is going on, you will miss the diagnosis. And when I think about medical error, I think a lot about the powers of observation. You know, um, I wrote a book called When We Do Harm about medical error. And the kind of error that's a procedure, a surgical procedure or central line, you can put a checklist in place and that can pretty much reduce medical error. But diagnostic error, making the wrong diagnosis, you can't checklist that because it's how we think. It's very hard to improve diagnostic error. But one of the ways that we can is listening really attentively, being so observant, being trying to put together the story of the many layers underneath, which is what novelists do. And I think we can become better clinicians. I'm convinced. I mean, are the data there? No, but I'm quite fine. And I think the difference between, a good doctor and a great doctor, if you find them, it wasn't what school they went to or how many, antibiotics they can reel off, without looking in the book. It's their ability to really talk with you, to listen to you, and make you feel heard, and to figure out what's really going on. That's quite a
Mhm.
skill.
Well, making someone feel heard is different from observing because, someone could be very stiff and clinical, be a scrupulous observer, but also be unapproachable or not make someone feel heard or make them feel like it's a safe place to be honest. And I think I learned from you the phrase hand on the doorknob moment. So
Mm.
that's a moment, as I think you described it once, where you've had the medical interview, it's almost over, the patient's leaving the room and their hands on the doorknob and they say something that changes the whole picture. Can you
Right. That
recall
happens
a few of those
all the time.
examples?
Yeah, a patient. I remember because she had this baseball cap on, and we were talking about hair loss. She had a young woman, too young for aging hair loss, and all kinds of aches and pains that didn't connect together. And and I examined her all these spots, and there was nothing really amiss. And so we finished the visit, and she walks out the door, and she's on the door, and she said, "Doctor, do you think those aches and pains had anything to do because those were the spots where my boyfriend shot me with a dart gun?" I was just stopped dead in my tracks and pulled her back, and I had not thought about domestic violence at all, and that was my big mistake, and my radar was not up. But, when someone comes in with all kinds of things that don't fit together organically, you need to think about these other things, and so maybe I hadn't made it, as safe a place for her to speak about that, but thankfully she did at the very end. You're right, they're not the same skill. We need them all, listening hard, observing carefully, letting the patient speak, not interrupting a patient, to hear the whole story, because if you interrupt a story, the story doesn't hold together. And there's so many parts, I think, to making a good clinician. But I do firmly feel that the creative side, can help. In fact, we're doing a creativity in medicine workshop with BLR on September 24th, which will be online, to do just that and to use uh, poetry, fiction, but also fine art. Here's another cover of BLR, another artist, and so we're also using the covers as ways to think about powers of observation. What can we learn? How can we become better clinicians? Or if you're a patient, how do I navigate a difficult patient session with my doctor or nurse? And are there things from the world of creativity that can help?
Mhm, mhm. I'm curious if there ever, uh sometimes I feel like doctors could benefit from a kind of journalism workshop in interviewing because that is what they're doing with patients a lot of times. And there are some, learnable skills about just letting the silence hang
Mm,
because someone will fill it if you don't fill it yourself. So that's where not interrupting. Someone
mm,
comes in and a higher level skill, which I got, I think, from this American Life and Radio Lab and some of those, is a skilled interviewer will sometimes repeat back an imperfect version of what they've heard, playing dumb a little bit, but it's a kind of nudge to do better. And so someone will usually improve on it and that's where you get, really good material. So that kind of thing is more about audience awareness, I suppose. I don't know, are med students trained in that kind of thing at all?
I mean, we do have, some, curriculum on medical interviewing. I don't think we give it as much attention as it needs, because in the end, that is the thing that you do the most of, is the interview, right? Most everything else, you know, um, is, confirmatory, secondary. And so I often think about, when I talk to my students, that, imagine, um, interviewing a patient, you know, um, who can't speak, can't communicate at all. It's very hard to figure out what's going on. I mean, you can examine, you can do a CT scan, but without the ability to communicate and hear the story, it's very challenging. So, of course, when you examine a baby, or examine someone who's comatose, it's very hard without that, and it makes you realize how much the interview, you know, part of it, the communication, the story, is so critical for making the diagnoses. Whereas if you were to practice medicine, you travel to an under-resourced location, or there's a blackout, or the system is down. It's hard when the system's down, but you can still, talk to the patient. Sorry for the sirens. uh, you can do a lot, but it's much harder. Practicing medicine in a blackout is much easier than practicing medicine with a comatose patient. You can do much more in a blackout,
Mm.
with a patient you can communicate with than the patient you can't communicate with.
Well, I might be stating the obvious, but this is why chatbots and algorithms are not good for things like medical interviews, or even the more automated things become in medicine, the less room there is for this kind of thing.
Sure, and I was thinking I did do a piece for the Times, about out AI, and partly as I had a patient, been a patient of mine for a long time. He was in singular intimacies, and I don't know, maybe half a year ago, I went out the waiting room. I saw him across the waiting room, and I looked at him. I said, I've got to admit this guy to the hospital." I knew it, and I couldn't even figure out why. It wasn't like visibly out of breath, but I just knew something about the way he was looking at me. He looked, I knew that he was really sick. And partly it's from knowing him for this, 20 some odd years at this point. I know him so well that when something's off, I can tell it, even if I can't even tell you what it is that's off. Um, and of course, and so I could put in 86-year-old man with diabetes and gout and CHF into the chatbot, and they can give me the amalgam of 86-year-old guys with CHF and gout, but not this one particular 86-year-old guy with CHF and gout, who I know, who the granddaughter who he raised was now, not talking to him, and shutting him out of uh, her life, and that trauma for him, that he kind of stopped taking his medications in the end, and that threw him in. But
Mm.
there was a whole thing of where the beginning of all of this was, and you can't do that now. The chatbots are great for other things, like, "Here's 50,000 lab test results. Am I missing some diagnosis?" And that is great, because you cannot know it all. And, "Oh, yeah, did you think about, type 4 RTA?" "Oh, no, I didn't. Thank you." Or, "Here's the 67 medications the patient's on. Any interactions?" "Oh, yeah, these 2 interact. How would I possibly know that?" So it's very handy for that, and I think we shouldn't,
Mhm.
throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I don't think you can substitute I mean, I guess you could, but I don't think it would be great medicine. I think we'd get many things right. Here's the blood pressure. We can check those boxes. But, why was this man in congestive heart failure? You wouldn't not figure that out with a chatbot, and you wouldn't be able to
Mhm.
fix it, because you'd just be like, "Oh, let's just tweak his medications." But that's not the reason that he went to heart failure. And um, yeah, so we have chatbots, but I think I hope there's always room for human clinicians.
Well, hopefully. I wanna go to Bellevue Literary Review now, and its, anniversary, so quarter century, big milestone. Can you take us back to the beginning of that? I know that you founded the journal right around the time, um, that 9/11 happened, and it kind of interfered with some of you thought it was gonna interfere with some of the events that you planned. So you had 9/11 and then the war in Afghanistan, and you were kind of questioning, is anybody gonna come to our poetry readings? Does this matter? Is this making any kind of
Mm.
difference? So, um,
But
how did you deal with that, and what was it like?
so our first issue was September 2001, and we'd been like gearing up for a year for this, and we were, so excited to go, and we had planned our first reading. It was going to be the 7th of October of that year. And then, of course, 9/11 happened. And of course, at Bellevue, we went into, trauma mode and discharged everyone from the hospital, expecting, thousands of casualties, which sadly did not transpire. Um, and it was just, if those of you who are listening who may remember that time, it was an incredible time in the city. I have never experienced anything like that. Just like the communal grief. It was just so powerful, especially at the hospital, because people started quickly putting up posters of the missing all over all the hospitals. And we have 3 hospitals in a row. And at that time, Bellevue was under construction for our new building. So we had a city block long construction wall. So it was just plastered with pictures, um, which stayed up for months. And of course, at that point, after things happened, everyone on those pictures were dead. But of course, all those pictures were people with graduation pictures, weddings. Everyone in the pictures is smiling, and everyone looking at the pictures is weeping. It was so devastating. They had to open a back entrance to the hospital. Because it was just too traumatic. And so we were like, and we had planned this reading. Is anyone gonna? Who wants to come? Hear poetry. In the middle of this thing. But we thought, all right, we've already like booked the room. We've booked the poets to come, and so we planned it. And then that morning was the invasion of Afghanistan. So now, like, we're at war, like, nobody's going to come. And you know what? It was standing room only. It was packed. We had more than 100 people. Like, come to a public hospital, walking past all these sea of faces of people who have died just recently and still came. And it really just pointed out to us, I think, that that is where people turn in moments of communal grief or any grief. We turn to art. And I think we always have, from time immemorial, to music, to art, um, to all of these things where do you go with the unspeakable?
Mm,
Because just like when we talk about the top 10 tips for asthma, here's the top 10 tips for grief. That's not going to help you. But being together and being, with art in a way that can speak to you, is a way to, give you that little drip of solace that maybe you can hold on to that strand as you do the hard work of grieving. And so that's kind of how things started. And, we just kept getting more and more submissions. And it's clear that people want to use the creative arts to grapple with these things. And so
mm,
for 19 years, we continued doing that. We had 2 readings, a fall reading, a spring reading, and then COVID hit. And once again, the hospital's turned upside down. Uh, at that point, like, everything that's not clinical has got to go. And so
mhm,
Bellevue, we had to leave. We were part of NYU. We had to leave NYU. um, and
mm,
I remember thinking, God, can this not wait? I was working in the COVID tent during the crisis. So, we're doing testing, we're PPP'd up, it's raining, it's freezing, it's quite a time. And meanwhile, I'm trying to, at night, trying to find a place for BLR to live, but nobody wants to take you in the middle of a global pandemic. So we decided to become our own 501(c)(3) nonprofit in the midst of this crisis. Turned out to be the best thing we ever did. And, in the years since then, which is about 5, 6 years now, we've almost quintupled in size. We've now expanded because the pandemic, as with everyone, had us try out online events. And now we have many more events like this creativity and medicine workshop. We do writing workshops now. We have a book club. We have a conversations on creative writing and healthcare series. We've done in-person events, live storytelling. We've done a dance poetry series, film series, where we give
mhm,
4 dancers take 4 poems and interpret them, and we create a film and then, submitting to film festivals. We've done studio visits with the artists and the covers. So it's been just this complete flowering of creativity that being your own organization allows you to do. And so, yeah, when we first started, I have an image of, sitting in my clinic office with my co-editor trying to weigh different sheets of paper that all, feel like they weigh the same, and 16 shades of ecru cream and linen. Like, what are we doing? A nephrologist and
mhm,
internist trying to pick paper. But we could not have imagined that 25 years later we'd still be here and thriving. And I think it's because it's not just a literary magazine. It is a community of people who want to think about how we grapple with illness and use the creative arts to do so. And that is people who read, people who write, people who want to, shape their own writing. They want to listen to others. They want to watch things that make sense with that. And it's such a really inspiring community of people that this feels like why we're still going strong and so planning for the next 25 years.
Hmm. Well, congrats on all that. So many achievements, and definitely surviving the institutional cut. Finding your own funding is a huge win, and something I think the humanities needs to learn more of. It's just this self preservation technique going forward in the
Mhm.
future. Um, when you're talking about 9/11 as this kind of communal time, I remember I was teaching around that time, and it was that way for some people, in America, but also for Muslim Americans, it was not. It was, an estranging time, but I don't know that that was really covered as much then. Now I'm just thinking about this is the
Mm.
2025 Best American Essays edited by Gia Tolentino. And so many of these are explicitly political and about um, international events, about Palestine and things. I wonder if it's possible for a journal to have a truly inclusive space or if there's like political lanes that we have to occupy. I don't know how you navigate that. I'm just thinking that 2001 is a very different moment in time from
Mm.
2026. Is that something that you talk about as an organization?
I mean, one of the things is, there are lots of lanes out there, and no journal has to occupy every lane. And I think there are journals for political discourse. We're not a political journal, and um, it's not that I don't ever want to publish anything that you know hits current events, but there are places for explicit political conversation that should be rigorous and debated, and that's why there are many journals. So we try to focus on things that are universal. But
Hmm.
we did an issue called "The Body Politic" on how the society around us impacts our bodies, and there's much. And then the truth is, all the issues, I mean, have stories like that because you can't avoid the outside world. But I kind of lean away from like these not these purity tests, but thou shalt must have this opinion or that opinion. Um, there's just lots of room for places to debate, and that's why we have so many journals. And thankfully, and I think that people
Hmm.
should support those journals. And if you want places to be reading things, places to submit your writing, go subscribe to a few of them. Be they literary, political, mainstream media. I think we do need that. I'm so glad that we have so many different things out there. So that's my feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm struggling with this myself, as a writer and thinking about where my voice fits best and things. But you said something about the universal, and that's how you and I both kind of came of age as writers, was in a time when a big part of creative nonfiction was you try to tap into this larger human narrative, and ideally it's bigger than you, and it teaches the reader about their own life as much as about yours. And I don't know how you feel about this, but it seems to me that we're in such a fragmented time that that idea of the universal is becoming less tenable. The idea that there's something that truly cuts across all these differences, whether it's gender identity or international events. Um, do you think the
I
universal is
still believe
possible?
I do. I really do. You know, any parent who's taking care of a sick child, that is universal, no matter. And now, of course, there are many variations on that. But rich, poor, war, not war. When your child is sick or on the verge, that is something primal. And I do think that there's something to be learned. And I believe there's things to be learned from other experiences. And I mean, obviously, I mean, in writing, we want the universal, but we want the particular. I mean, that's what makes great writing great is when we have the specific and the particular. And there's so much to learn from other experiences. And we're, of course, always actively seeking out other experience. I was looking back at one issue. I think we had stories taking place in like 8 different countries in one issue. And just by random chance, not by planning that, but that's where
Mhm.
things are coming from. And that's really exciting. And I do want to read things that are from different experiences. I do think there is things to learn, but I really do think, but in particular, in the issue in the our little arena of health, illness, and healing, there is a lot that is universal, even as the particulars vary. And those are important and should be respected and honored. And not everything is an equivalent, but it doesn't have to be equivalent to be important. They're just realities. And so often, we the individual people, we can't change so much of reality, even though we're born where we're born, right? We can't change our genetics or where we got plopped in the earth. And we can try and do our best with where we are. But I think many people do feel powerless, that there are things that you wish you could change that feel like forces greater than you. And we can't condemn people for not successfully changing and solving everything in the world. But I
Mm,
do think we can find some aspects are universal. And I think it's worth going for, even as you respect and appreciate the particular.
mhm. Well, that's a good segue to your, I think this was a year ago now in the Lancet, also an essay called Defiant Acts of Joy. And maybe we'll end with this. This is about your love of the cello. And even though you still struggle with mastery and have had a hard time, with
It's
life
forever. It's forever.
fitting it in between, kids and work and
Yeah.
everything else. So I want to get to the defiant part of it. Why does the cello, bring you joy? And why is that necessarily a defiant act?
Well, I got into cello when my daughter was starting violin, and I had kind of asked the teacher, "How do you get a stubborn kid to practice?" Thinking, sticker charts and ice cream. She's like, "No, sing a parent practice." Like, "Oh, all right. Well, maybe I'll take a cello lesson. I'll do the one thing next door." Anyway, I fell in love. My daughter later quit violin, but I fell in love, and
Mhm,
I mean, so I ended up writing a lot about it, and there's many many reasons why I find it so intoxicating. Part of it is, in medicine, it's not a lot about beauty in medicine. We don't think about the aesthetics very much, but in music, you are just always trying for something to sound beautiful. That is the goal, and beauty is so impractical. Right? It doesn't, earn a grant. It doesn't save a patient. It doesn't earn you money. And that's part of what makes it so amazing. And the same for literature. The fact that it is just moving and beautiful in and of itself, I find that astounding and pretty radical. But so I've been taking lessons, but basically I just, play in my living room and that's it. But a colleague of mine was trying to get me to join this orchestra up at the United Nations where he's been playing. And I am just like too busy. I have 3 kids. I got a book. I got a journal. I got a clinic. Um, and, and every like few months he tries again. And then, so this time he's like, um, but you have to come because they're doing Beethoven's Ninth. I thought, oh God, talk about a great, great piece. But I've never played an orchestra. And if you know anything about Beethoven's Ninth, it's big in every way you define that word. It's long, there's a lot of it. Apparently, by that point, Beethoven gave up caring whether or not his musicians could play it or not. He just wrote what he wanted to write. And I just said, all right, I'm going to try this. And so he emails me. It's like 33 pages, like 3,000 measures of music and a hard music. And the one thing I learned, like when I take lessons on my own, I work on 3 measures and the next week we work on 4 measures. Here you got to learn it all at once and you kind of do it all on the surface and you keep filling it. I have never worked as hard in my life. Josh, I like, cramming for the medical boards, piece of cake compared to cramming Beethoven's Ninth. I've never worked so hard in my life, but the music was so amazing. I'd play it like, how did I end up in this miracle of being in the middle of this unbelievable thing? And then we finally did our concert. And it's a marathon. It's like 90 minutes of music. It's truly, you're exhausted by the end. And we didn't even know, but as we're taking our bows, the first bombs are dropping in Iraq, the first US attack in Iraq, which we had no idea.
mm,
And
mm,
and here, this is the United Nations Orchestra. There's probably 50 countries represented in the musicians and the singers. You have like 150 people on stage. Such this thing of like unity. And of course, the message of Ode to Joy is all about the universal that we can, the universal brotherhood, as Beethoven would have said. And then we were suddenly at war again, was this shocking thing. And it made me think there's something sort of defiant about joy, right? And if you think about autocracies, throughout the world, throughout history, one of the things they try to quash is joy. Keeping
mm,
people scared, fragmented, that is the way, that most, think about Stalin, think about Hitler, think about Mao. I mean, these are, um, the populations were not joyful. They were taking away the abilities to be together, the abilities to communicate, the abilities to write, and that is a way of controlling the people.
Mhm.
And if you look at some, very often some of the rebellions against autocracy is in the sense of like trying to show, no, you can't take away my joy. I'm going to enjoy something here.
Mm.
And certainly Beethoven was at a miserable point of his life. He was sick. He was close to death. He was heartsick. He was intoxicated. He was deaf. And yet, he wrote the most joyful piece of music he probably ever wrote and maybe has ever been known. So it
Mm.
felt like at this moment, because, I remember thinking while practicing, why am I spending all this time learning this piece of music? It doesn't get me anywhere. Our society is falling apart. Our current government, I should be fighting, at the
Mm.
barricades. Yet I'm doing
Mm.
this, but it also felt like defiant that no, we're going to get together, all these people, and do something joyful together. So it was a great experience.
Well, you've anticipated one of my questions, which is, as you say, the doom scrolling makes you feel like you ought to be doing more. I think you compare, ICE detention now to people being disappeared in Argentina, or Romania. So things that we've in America seen play out elsewhere, are happening here, and it's terrifying. It's abhorrent, and so when you fixate on that and you think, well, I have to be out in the trenches fighting, not escaping through art. Some do see it as an escape and a kind of abnegation of more responsibility.
Right, but I
And
think
so,
so I think there's a difference. You can put your head in the sand and just put your headphones on and just listen to Bach 24/7, which, I've thought about that. So, when I read the newspaper, I'm like, "Oh my god." But no, so it's a different. You can do both. You can do both. That you go to the rallies and you write your congresspeople and you try to, vote out the people who are harming our society, that you have to stay engaged. And you have to actually, you know, and you can stay engaged without doom scrolling. Like, I think doom scrolling is just this, you know, ability to just sort of assault yourself, as opposed to, I will, educate myself with a reliable source that has an end, right? Not a forever thing. So try an actual, if I can recommend, newspaper where you can read the news and then you finish and you put it down and you go do something else. But I think
mhm,
also bringing people together for a sense of community and joy is really important. Um, Again, not like the Titanic that you're just like playing the music while we're going down, but you can do both. You can do both. And I think bringing people together and not succumbing to fear, because otherwise you just sit under your covers and shiver all in 24/7 because the world does seem like a miserable place. But I think we can do both. It's not an abnegation. It's an abnegation if you do nothing else. But, am I doing one thing this week? Am I writing one letter? Am I making a donation to some organization that, I can help with my resources? Am I supporting one person, you know, who is struggling with our current, you know, situation? And not all at once, but a few small things. Am I
mhm.
am I not letting myself say, "All right, I can't read anything. I'm not looking at the news ever again," because that's tempting too. But then that's abnegating. I think we have to stay engaged, but we could also be joyful and bring art and not let art get co-opted. I mean, again, if you think about, you know, Hitler and Stalin, co-opting art was a big part of the playbook. Very much so. And if you look at art, look at the National Endowment of the Arts. I mean, co-opting the arts is part of this, pulling back
Yeah.
these grants. And I think fighting that and not
Mhm.
letting, all these arts institutions close down. So if your local arts institution has lost its funding, go out and support it. Go to their concert, buy their journal.
Yep.
Um,
Well,
that
there
may
there
not
was a
feel like,
tradition. Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. There was a tradition of Samizdat in Czechoslovakia, under communist rule, which is
Russia.
a similar kind of defiance. I might read this if you don't mind, because
Sure.
it's right from the essay, and I think
Yeah.
addresses this. So you write, joy can also be defiance. Autocratic regimes strive to make you feel alone, hopeless, and powerless. It's a time-tested strategy to break the spirit of the public. So it's no accident that joy has been a subversive element in fighting autocracies during the 20th century in Chile, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, as well as in the American Civil Rights Movement. Joy bolsters hope, a confidence that despite current ambiguities and anguish, possibilities yet remain. It is a willingness to grapple with both what is and what could be, a rebuff to the easy cynicism of those who retire to the sidelines and fill in the blank doom scroll, whatever is paralyzing
Mm.
but not renewing. And so for you, music is defiant because it's renewing in the face of a time when the impetus is to enervate or terrify or intimidate. Is that accurate?
Right, right, or just close yourself off and bury yourself and say, "This world, I just wanna get through my little day,"
Mhm,
which it's an understandable instinct. I mean, it's exhausting to live in our society, no matter where you are. It's very tiring to tiring maybe is the wrong word, but just to hear about things going on, and it's so many things. Where do I go? Do I try to rescue Head Start? Do I try to, donate to the food? But where do I go? There's so many things you feel powerless. But if you can pick 3 things, that you could help out, and that's all you have to do, and then you have done something. Because if every single person picks 2 or 3 things, that's a lot of things. Um, and I
mhm,
hope for your own sake that one of those things does bring joy, because otherwise, how do you sustain yourself if you spend all your time doing all the hard work of organizing, and then you yourself so depleted that then you can't function at some point? That's not,
mhm,
helping the cause. So I think and I think about the civil rights movement. How often were people singing? And what if you think back of it? I mean, those were joyful songs. They were defiant songs, but there was joy and beauty, and it's also really it's really hard to come up against that if you are, the police are, and then people are just singing at you. And you think about the creativity, or in China when people, or in Tiananmen Square, Hong Kong protests with the blank white signs. Like there were something that was creative and thoughtful, or the umbrellas of ways of bringing people together. That's a little bit kind of slyly joyful. And you mentioned Samizdat, and I remember being in the stacks of my library in college, and I think one of the things we don't get by doom scrolling is the ability to randomly find something that's not connected by an algorithm. And so I was looking for some kind of journal, and I stumbled upon a journal of Samizdat from Russia. And the whole idea of Samizdat, of passing things hand to hand, of keeping it alive, keeping art alive, that was so critical, because art was the lifeblood
mhm,
of people, and it still is. It still is. People are smuggling out, things that people write and people do. And it was during the Nazi regime too, smuggling that art taken care of. In fact, I just went to an exhibit. Um, uh, it was at the Jewish Museum, where someone was renovating a house, I think in Belgium, and uncovered in the wall all this artwork that someone hid, while they were racing out the door, and being rounded up. And someone hid that artwork, and it stayed there for some 80 years. And it was so essential to preserve that artwork. And that was someone's humanity was there.
mhm, mhm. Well, it's so powerful. Secret Keeping art secret and keeping it alive, undercover, has many, many forms that we could trace throughout history. So to think of that as something we can do now, even through the act of writing an essay, the writing life often is not online. It is the long incubation period of being alone at your desk and learning to be comfortable with silence and fill that with meaning. That's kind of the perennial challenge of art. We have just a few minutes left. So if you've joined us, thank you. And we have maybe time for a couple of questions. If anyone wants to post something into the chat, um, we'll watch that as we wrap up here. So while we're waiting for that, Danielle, you've navigated some of these challenges that are kind of bureaucratic with art funding and things to keep BLR alive. What's your advice to the next generation, medical students who think that the medical humanities is important, but they're coming into these institutions where it's never been a priority. You always have to fight for funding. It's always vulnerable to being cut as a low priority. How do you keep it going in an increasingly corporate kind of medical environment?
To stay optimistic and have hope, because always, wherever you go, if there's 100 people, there's going to be 5 or 10 people who are interested in that, or feel the need for something more, and you will find those people. And one thing, interestingly, I found now is that medical school institutions pay a lot of attention because students are now kind of like customers and they want to, they have to please the customer to get their business. And so there's a little more attention. If the students are interested in that, forget the faculty, like I don't care what we want. But if the students want something and push for that, there's a little more listening to that. Find your peeps, and peep up and raise your voice, and let people know that this is what you're interested in, and find those sources and support them. Subscribe to those journals, read them, tell people about them, go to their events. It makes such a difference. And there is enough out there. And of course, keeping these things funded. I mean, since I spend my day and night doing, and that's the least, sort of creative of it. But someone once said that fundraising is friend raising. And it's true. If you
Mm.
think of it that way, I'm not trying to raise money. I'm trying to network people who are interested in this. And then they'll come and hopefully they'll support us financially. But that's really what it's turned out to be. So it's actually not quite as bureaucratic, as one might think from the outside. It's just keep finding the people and, um, because if you ask around enough, and that, especially with something as universal as illness, most people they've been there. They've been terrified in that room. And so when you talk about that as the impetus, there's a flash of recognition. Even the biggest CEO boss has been sitting there in a paper gown once, nervous to know what the results will be. Even that person, and even the billionaires can't, despite what the tech bros say, it is not buying you eternal life. You will still be out there at one moment being terrified. If not for you, then your child or your parent. And you will know that feeling. And that's what we try to bring out, that this is universal and this is worthwhile. And there are hopefully enough people who agree with you. And I think there are.
Mhm, mhm. Well, that's lovely, thanks. So we had one question about, what you're working on now, so maybe we'll circle back to the beginning. Let us know again, when to watch for your next book, the title, and, when that's coming out?
Sure. So the new book is called The Body Knows How to Die, and it's coming out in April of 2027. And it'll be about how we face our fears of death. And I am very excited. Well, the cover reveal is going to come soon. We're working on that. So I send out a monthly newsletter from DanielleOfri.com. If you're on that list, you'll see the new cover. I think it's going to be beautiful. And I'm very excited about that. And then what can I tell you? I'm on the sixth suite of Bach. Finally made it that far on the first movement, and it's taken me a year, but I have turned the page. So I'm now officially on page 3 after 1 year of being on page 1 and 2. That's how slow it is. But yes, I have turned the page, so I'm feeling very, very excited about that.
Well, life with the cello will go on, it sounds like.
Yes, and the orchestra's still going. We're at Beethoven's third piano concerto is coming up in the spring. So that's our
Nice.
next tackle.
My 10-year-old's a cellist as well, so, it's a
Yeah,
lovely, beautiful
bravo.
instrument.
Yeah.
All right. Well, to learn more about Danielle's writing and buy her books, check out Danielle Ofri. That's OFRI.com. And I'll include a link, as I always do, in the show notes. Next time, I'll speak with Dr. Devika Bhushan, pediatrician, former Surgeon General of California, and author of a children's book series focused on stress and resilience. Dr. Bhushan also writes a Substack newsletter, Spread the Light. So that's the thing not named for today. Until next time, thanks to everyone who joined us. Bye now.